But welcome to the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion's Anti-Racism Summer Series. This is the second annual. We kicked it off last summer in the thick of the racial uprisings of 2020. My name is Erin Corey. If you don't know me, I was hired to the college just last fall in the middle of the pandemic to help build our capacity for LGBTQ inclusion. And I'm the resource coordinator, and I sit in both the Office of IDEI and in Mission and Ministry. And a lot of this session today is about the way that our offices work together on our college. So before we get into the thick of today's session, by way of introduction to our series, I'm going to share a brief message from our president, Father Sicard.
Good afternoon and welcome to our second summer series on important subjects related to racial justice and equity. I'm grateful to the staff in our Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for their work in putting together what promises to be an excellent series of discussions. I also appreciate the commitment of our faculty members, staff, and students who will share their expertise and insights. By truly engaging with each other, we learn and we grow. And we have a good opportunity to do just that through this series. Our work toward becoming a beloved community continues, and I want to reaffirm my commitment, which is shared across all levels of college leadership, including the Board of Trustees. We will not reach our full potential until we are a community where all of us can participate equally and justly. This is the way Jesus calls on us in the Gospels to live our lives, and it's fundamental to our Catholic mission and identity. We've made good progress by working together over the past year, but I'm the first to say that we have a lot yet to do. And your presence here today tells me that you're willing to join us in this work, and I thank you. Our presenters today have a lot of ground to cover, and we want you to participate. So I leave you with my best wishes for an engaging and productive session. May God bless you and God bless Providence College.
Beautiful. So our aim with this summer series, especially after all the events of 2020, a pandemic, racial awareness in a catalytic moment spurred on by a lot of trauma and pain shared nationally, is that we want to offer opportunities to dialogue with both inside and outside experts about what does that actually look like in our context at Providence College, where this Catholic Dominican liberal arts college in Providence, Rhode Island, and how does all of this come to bear in our bodies, in our shared intellectual journey together. If you've been around the college at any point in the last year or so, you will have heard the phrase beloved community a lot. It's in our strategic plan. It's mentioned, like Father Sicard said, at all levels of college leadership. And just a bit of the history on this campus is that Bernice King, the daughter of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was here in, I believe, 2018. We had her here sharing and speaking on this concept that her father was pitching vision for all the way up until he was murdered. He was talking about a beloved community of racial integration, of justice, and a preferential option for the poor. And he was, I think, a prophet in our nation about the sort of healing that we need as a community. And so part of this series this year is, we said post-pandemic, and I hope it's not too soon to use those words, but as we're starting to phase out of the pandemic, what does it look like to embody that vision here? So if you haven't joined the prior sessions where we've covered topics like, is critical race theory fundamentally at odds with our Catholic faith or other faiths? Are there ways that they can be in tension with one another to draw out something better from each other? We have understood more the roots of anti-Asian violence in our country and how best to support our Asian and Asian American community members. We've learned about trauma from Dr. Richard Booth, especially how trauma is operating on a variety of levels for Black, Indigenous, folks of color. And also, we're offered actual tools for how we might pursue healing. And today, I'm really honored for two folks that I have grown to enjoy, genuinely respect greatly, and learn a lot from, to keep going in this conversation of what does an embodied beloved community look like here. I would say from my brief journey with the college so far, still in some ways as someone on the outside looking in, becoming a part of the community, I think one of the gifts, but one of the tensions I've noticed here at PC is that in our diversity, we're bringing so many different frameworks and pedagogies and lived experiences to the table. And at best, that is like the best learning environment that we could ask for, to learn and be curious and strengthened by one another. But at worst, sometimes we are speaking different languages and we're speaking past each other. And so part of why I wanted to invite Pam Tremblay, Dr. Dana Dillon, who I'll introduce shortly, into this series is that we have experts on our campus through their work, through their faith, that can help us pull and understand out of our tradition, how do you contextualize the work of racial justice, of diversity, of equity, inclusion here at PC. So that is our aim today, is sort of a primer on Catholic social teaching from one of the experts. So please welcome Pam Tremblay, who will be moderating, who is our Director of Service Immersion and Social Justice, and Dr. Dana Dillon, one of our Associate Professors of Theology.
Thanks, Erin, and to DEI and Mission colleagues for inviting me to moderate today's conversation. The dialogue between faith, justice, religion, and works of service has marked my tenure in higher education, and I'm grateful to moderate today's talk. In 2016, the Catholic bishops published a document entitled Everyday Christianity to Hunger and Thirst for Justice. They began their document with a series of questions that touch back to what Erin was saying around the challenge for Christians to connect faith and justice. They wrote, one of the great challenges for Christians is as old as our faith, but is to take on special urgency today as we approach the third Christian millennium. How do we connect worship on Sunday to work on Monday? How is the gospel proclaimed not only in the pulpits in our parishes, but also in the everyday lives of Catholic people? The bishops go on to make clear that every believer is called to serve the least of these and to hunger and thirst for justice, to be peacemakers, and that Catholics are called by God to protect human life, to promote human dignity, to defend the poor, and to seek the common good. That the social mission of the church belongs to all of us, and it is an essential part of what we do as believers. With that being said, I'm grateful to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Dana Dillon, who embodies much of what this tension and document of the Catholic bishops put forth, and who's going to unpack for us key principles that mark our identity as a Catholic college and how these principles provide for us a map as we seek to bring about the beloved community here on campus. Dr. Dana Dillon is an associate professor here at Providence College and holds a joint appointment in both theology and public and community service studies. She received her PhD from Duke University after earning her BA and MDiv from the University of Notre Dame. Most of her current teaching centers around Catholic social teaching, community service and engagement in racial justice, and her early research centered around action theory and virtue ethics. In addition to the professional side, Dana also brings a wealth of volunteer experience, including with the National Alliance for Mental Illness, where she has served both as a family-to-family program teacher and trainer, as well as past president and current board member. Dr. Dillon, your willingness to have us tap into your wisdom last year and this year again, and your expertise as it comes to Catholic social teaching, virtue ethics, and the embodiment of what it means to hunger and thirst for justice is something myself and our college as a whole are continually grateful for. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Pam and Erin, and also Father Sicard for all the words that started us off here. And I dropped a link. Hopefully you're able to access that through OneDrive, SharePoint, and see the handout. If there's a problem with that, because Erin and Pam both have access to that, so one of them can troubleshoot that. So put it in the Q&A. But I'm going to assume everybody has it and dive right in. So in this handout, what I've put together is, I actually was going to start with what is now page 2. That's something that I've put together in the past to sort of compile from the compendium of the social doctrine of the church, really these foundational principles. They foreground the dignity of the human person, and then the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. Those key concepts follow from that, and there's other concepts under that. And so you can see that I'm not actually going to talk through that part of it. because as I thought about our limited time together, because I do want to keep this relatively brief so that we can have time for further Q&A, I decided to put some of those principles together in this handout that the kind of page 1 that I'm going to walk you through, with Catholic foundations for DEI work. These 9 things, and these are 9 things that I put together. In fact, I was kind of aiming for 10. I realized 10 wouldn't fit on the page, so we stopped at 9. And these are just things that I put together that I thought would be helpful for us to talk through. Many of them are rooted in the concepts on page 2, so we'll talk through that a little bit as we go. The other thing that I want to say about this, just some of the context of Catholic social thought. Many of you know, if we have any graduates of the DWC program here, Catholic social thought really gets its start in the modern era from in 1891 with Leo XIII, Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, which is on the condition of labor or the working classes. And so it really is this engagement of what are in this moment of what we're facing. In 1891, it was the new crisis for labor as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And he in that moment, he said, well, what does our Catholic tradition speak to in this moment? And Catholic social thought has continued to do that same thing. And so I tried to put some of this together for DEI work. But the other thing to know about this is Catholic social teaching is pretty much always pitched so that anyone of goodwill, whether they are a believing Catholic, a believing Christian who's not Catholic, a member of another faith tradition entirely, or no faith at all, but people of goodwill who are interested in justice can engage this work. So that's one of the things that you'll see in this. I tried to mostly pitch it in that way, but also just as a reminder to everybody, everything about this, including really every aspect of this, is rooted in a sense of Christ, of a God who so loved the world to become human, to walk amongst us, and what that does for our understanding, for instance, of the human person and what we owe one another. And so just so that you know that this is kind of pitched for all to engage, but it's also really deeply rooted in the person and the work of Christ. So with that, let me dive in and walk us through these. And again, I encourage you, Pam is going to be paying attention to the Q&A. So if at any point throughout this, you want to drop a question into the Q&A, Pam will bring us back to those when I wrap up. So first and absolutely most central is the dignity and sacredness of every human person, beloved child of God and created in God's own image. And I thought it was important to point this out. This dignity is irrevocable, inviolable, and in no way conditional on any identity, status, action, or choice. I think that's really crucial. You don't get more human dignity for being Christian or Catholic or good or smart or pretty or anything. And this dignity is so inviolable that also when you become a serial killer, you still have this dignity. We can talk in sensible ways about the ways that you're not living up to your dignity when you're a serial killer or all the other little sins that many of us engage in. We can talk about the ways that acting as a sinner in whatever way or acting in evil ways is contrary to our dignity. That's a very sensible way to think about it, but it doesn't diminish the dignity. And I will say, just to pull some of these threads, for instance, racism in particular, we want to talk about somebody who acts as a racist. Again, they don't act in accord with their dignity, and they don't act in accord with the dignity of their neighbor, but they don't actually diminish their dignity in doing that. It's a key point here. The next point really follows from the dignity of the human person and a very Catholic understanding of the human person, which is the intrinsically social nature of the human person, made in the image and likeness of a God who is in fact persons in communion, right? We believe in a Trinity. And this is something that I think we get wrong all the time because we're so used to a very liberal individualistic culture where my rights and my responsibilities are my own alone. And we act as though our communal, political, social engagements are something that are added on, that if I choose them, I can choose to be in relationship with these other people in the world. The Catholic understanding is very different than that. We are made always already in relationship with one another. We are made for relationship with God and with one another. And this really reshapes a lot of the things that we might, a lot of the claims that we might make on one another. So again, to use an example around race relations, many people report, well, of course I'm not a racist and I don't tend to encounter people of other races in my particular life, whatever that is. But think about, I like to invite people to think about, what would it mean if, when we think about the communion of persons that is the Trinity, if they were kind of friendly at a distance and never ran into each other, right? This is not how we should be thinking about our community life if we're thinking from a Catholic theological perspective. And again, that idea deeply informs all these claims that run throughout Catholic social thought. The third point here is the understanding of the common good as the ordering of communities for the flourishing of all persons and of each person. And that's paired with this idea that each person has both the right and the responsibility to work towards this flourishing. Again, all in each, right? And the conditions that will promote it. So just to break this down a little further, we do not, as Catholics, when we talk about the common good, we are not talking about the greatest good for the greatest number. That's utilitarianism. That's right. That's another thing. We are actually aiming for a world where the person who is worst off is still flourishing in the best way that they can. Like and again, part of this is I have both the right and the responsibility to work towards those conditions. So the way I put this sometimes is I have responsibility for my own flourishing, my own happiness, but I also have responsibility for yours. And even more so, and I think this will get fleshed out with the next point, even more so, the person that I never noticed or never thought about, and I haven't been thinking about their flourishing at all, I didn't even realize that they exist because in whatever way they're on the margin, I'm actually responsible for promoting their flourishing too. And of course, they have a right to participate and work for that flourishing in the midst of the community as well. So let's talk about preferential option for the poor, which is number 4. In official Catholic social thought, this is usually talked about as specifically the preferential option for the poor, but it's often paired with this idea of the vulnerable, the marginalized, or sometimes the least of these, because of Matthew 25, where Jesus talks about whatever you did to the least of these, you did to me. But this idea of the preferential option for the poor is really rooted in the Exodus story, where God takes the side of the Israelites who are enslaved in Egypt and sets them free, liberates them. And there are so many other aspects of the Old Testament where God is caring for widows, orphans, strangers, foreigners, all these kinds of things. And then of course, in the gospel, Jesus is always seeking table fellowship, right? And care for the lepers, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, all these folks who are vulnerable and marginalized. And the idea here is that if God keeps seeking out and choosing the side of the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized, and if Christ says, whatsoever you do to the least of these, you do to me, then we who are seeking to be Christians or informed by Catholic theology are also called to make a preferential option for the poor. And I always point out to my students, it's not an option. The word option is in there, because we're talking about choosing the poor, right? Making an option for the poor. But this is actually, I think we can take it as a command of the gospel and as an invitation and a key component of Catholic social thought. And again, I think the implications for DEI work and racial justice are obvious in this one. I thought it was important to say this too, that it is the case in the Catholic tradition that, and this is where I branch out maybe a little bit from Catholic social thought per se, although this informs those things as well. The Catholic tradition does understand there to be truths, including truths about the nature of the human person and the moral good, that can be objectively known through reason, though of course faith is an important pairing with reason. And I think one of the reasons it's really important to talk about this in terms of racial justice work and DEI work more generally is that, really from the point of view of Catholic theology, part of the reason why we need to be so committed to the human person is we believe that the dignity of the person can be known objectively through reason, and including the idea that dignity is not in any way lessened because of race or ethnicity or any of the identity, gender, right? Any of the identities that we might be an aspect of any human person's identity. But there's an objective truth about the good of the person, and therefore also an objective truth to the wrong of racial injustice. And I think that that's really important. This is not, it's a good idea. There's an objective truth here that is really important to know and to acknowledge. Number 6 here, I thought that this is really important to point out because sin is a part of the tradition here, right? So the understanding that no one is perfect, right? This biblical quote that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and that all are called to deeper growth, holiness, and conversion, growth, and holiness. And I can't really see the list of who's out there right now, but whoever the very best person on this call is, I'm certain it's not me, whoever the very best person is, that person has room to grow and get better, room to move towards holiness. And whoever the very worst person is on this call, I'm tempted to name a name. No, I won't do that. I'm completely kidding. It's probably me. Also, still have that dignity that we were talking about with number 1 up above. And so, but there is a particular obligation, I think, those of us who aim to be followers of Christ, right? We're supposed to form our consciences to really discern and think through and learn what justice should look like, what holiness should look like, and see the ways that we're falling short, and really work on moving ourselves forward and moving one another forward in community together. And again, there's a deep sense here of part of the way we grow in virtue is by engaging, whether we're talking about lives of the saints or lives of moral exemplars, but also engaging with other people in community who are both aiming to be better, right, and discerning the forms of sin and injustice that are operating on us. And one of the reasons I think that this is really important to note here is, the one other thing I wanted to note on this is with virtue, there's a long tradition of one of the quotes that just comes to mind is the courageous man has fears that the coward can't imagine. There's a sense here that in any virtue, courage being one of the courage or fortitude being one of the cardinal virtues, the more you grow on it, the more you grow in that virtue, the more you can see how much room you do have to grow, and the kinds of things that you need to reject. And one of the reasons I point this out is there can be unevenness in our development in these virtues. And I think especially when we're talking about aiming for something like racial justice, we have such a diversity of experience and history and engagement with that from everybody in our community that it's really, really important that we're willing to learn from one another. And again, it's not that I have less dignity, that I haven't learned and grown as much as Pam has, right? It's actually that we're in this together, working towards a greater understanding of virtue, love, truth, faithfulness, etc. So that's just something we can talk about more. Also in Catholic social thought, really important idea here. Although there's, in Catholic moral theology, generally, we talk so much about personal sin, but Catholic social thought has also turned attention to sinful social structures. This is the idea, and you know this, right? That there are all kinds of institutions that develop in societies and cultures that embody not justice, but injustice. And these need to be approached by social analysis and change, right? And I made a reference to this idea of see, judge, act. This is this idea that runs through a lot of Catholic social thought kinds of literature, of you really, and actually the way I teach this in Catholic social thought here at Providence College, students have a project where it's a research project, and they have to name an injustice. They have to actually rely on social science sources for some social analysis. Then they rely on Catholic social thought for value judgment. And then they have to have a plan, a strategy for changing it. So this is just an approach that often is taken in terms of Catholic social thought. I wanted to take a moment here and talk a little bit about Catholic universities. And this, if you haven't read Ex Corde Ecclesiae, which is John Paul II's encyclical on Catholic universities, it's really important. But just to draw a few key things from that. These universities are Catholic universities are understood to be places where truth is sought in the context of community and dialogue, including dialogue among different disciplines, but also dialogue between faith and reason, and dialogue between the gospel and cultures, and dialogue between the Christian tradition and modern society. These are all concepts that are named in Ex Corde Ecclesiae. And the idea here is that really Catholic universities have an advantage in presenting our students with an integrated understanding of the world, what it means to be human, and God, because we're aiming to integrate these disciplines and these perspectives. And I think that's a really important thing. One other thing related to racial justice that I want to name explicitly, I think I talked about this last year, so I didn't want to repeat myself too much, but insofar as you think about us as a Catholic university here in the United States of America in this moment, I think one of the important things as we talk about dialogue between gospel and culture is the importance of bringing the gospel in line with our culture's, in dialogue with our culture's values, not in line with our culture's values, such that we can embrace aspects of it and also critique aspects of it. I think one of the things that's been really important is that we've increasingly become able to dialogue about basically critiquing some of these structural legacies of slavery and racism in our society, but particularly because of our Catholic identity, we're really called to do more of that, and again, continue to critique the society that we're immersed in, and engage it in terms of gospel values. And the final point here is to talk just a little bit about the idea of unity and diversity in the perspective of the church. The church really is committed to both, and in a way that doesn't compromise on either. And I think that this sometimes almost seems nonsensical, but it's really important. And I like to compare it actually to, we're going to talk about St. Paul and the body of Christ in just a moment here, but I also like to point out to people, like, if you haven't thought about it lately, think about the ridiculousness of the church's claim that God is a Trinity. If God hadn't revealed it to us, it would be crazy talk. And because we're talking about a God who is at one time 3 and 1, right? everything else we know about the concept of three and the concept of one is that they're mutually exclusive. You cannot be both three and one at once. In the same way, I think we can think a little bit about unity and diversity. Is there a way that we can all truly be united and truly united as one, and also really celebrate genuine diversity in each and every unique identity that each one of us has as a person? And the Catholic Church is really committed to both, and to both unity and diversity. Let me talk a little bit about this image that St. Paul uses, right? This is in 1 Corinthians. It's this idea that the church is the body of Christ. It's one body, and yet the uniqueness of all the different parts of the body, the multiplicities of roles and function, don't undermine the body, the unity of the body, but in fact serves it. We don't need 50 hands in the body, right? We want the 2 hands, we want the 2 eyes, the 2 ears, right? I won't get into all the details, you know your body, but we need every part of the body in order to flourish. And each being itself in all its fullness and all its flourishing is what leads to the whole flourishing and acting as one. And so I think that that's a really important part of this. And just to say one last thing that I thought I might have said before, but I had a note to make sure I didn't forget it. So I think sometimes people also think about, well, the church says it wants a unity of cultures, but we all know that really at the end of the day, they want us to all kind of look like the church from whatever year in clearly somewhere in Europe in the Middle Ages or something. And I think that was true for a while, but really since the Vatican II era, the church has really come a long way on the dignity and beauty of every culture in the world, and the idea that it's really crucial that the church is itself incarnated in each culture, right? As communities of Christians gather in each country, each place in the world, there's this real sense that just like we talk about Christ elevating each person, right? So I'm the best Dana I can be in my fullness and flourishing when I'm in relationship with Christ. So too, each culture, as it's put in relation, as it's embodied in the lives of Christians who are in and of that culture, comes to its fullness and its flourishing. And that actually just kind of takes us back to the beginning in a way. When you're really thinking about the dignity of each person, each culture, it's about each of us having the access and the ability to participate in building our own flourishing and the flourishing of those around us. And so that's why it's so crucial for us to do this work. And it's so deeply rooted in our mission and our identity as a Catholic school. And with that, I'm going to wrap up for now. And Pam's going to tell me what questions you've been putting into the chat.
Yeah, Dr. Dillon, thank you so much for providing us these foundational principles that light our path in DI work at a Catholic and Dominican college. For all of our participants, Dr. Dillon covered a lot of information in a short period. So we invite you to put any questions you might have in the question box or in the chat feature, or even places that you'd like Dr. Dillon to expand upon a little bit more. And we'll do our best to get to as many questions and areas of expansion that we can. One of the questions that came in, Dr. Dillon, is from Comfort, and you spoke about it in a lot of different places about flourishing. So the common good is for the flourishing of people. You spoke about it at the end about the flourishing of each body part and each member. And maybe could you define for us a little more about what flourishing means? The question from Comfort was, what about the situations where flourishings conflict? And so can flourishings conflict? And then some of the nitty gritty of like, okay, well, if we're responsible for flourishing, how do we do it?
Yeah, those are great questions and hard questions, to be honest. But I mean, I actually, especially when I talk with students, I actually talk about, like, for a minute, don't think about the common good, like all over the world. Think about a family who really love one another, right? And I mean, I think this happens all the time, right? When a parent says, hey kid, your flourishing to me looks like going to this school, or I mean, let's start really easy. You don't see it right now, but your flourishing includes you need to brush your teeth right now, right? Like these you need to study, you need to. So part of that is that kind of a thing of sometimes somebody really does know better than the other person. And again, part of what I meant to suggest a little bit before when I talked about the different levels of virtue is I do think sometimes, like one way to look at this is when the person who doesn't, let's just say doesn't have housing or doesn't have healthcare or what have you, is talking to you about what they need in order to flourish, right? Listen to the ones on the margins who are expressing the need, right? I think that's a big part of it. But I think the other thing, as your kids get older, right, and you begin to talk about, well, I don't think this relationship is not the best relationship for you, right? There's how do we discern that together so that somebody who really cares about me can say, look, here are the ways where I think this relationship you're in is not actually contributing to your flourishing. And I think that at the end of the day, interpersonally, right, we often come to this point with someone we love where we find a way to say, I love you. I don't have the right to insist on you doing this my way and not your way, right? And so we try to, bring ourselves to embrace their flourishing on their own terms. I think there's another question, and I mean, I'm actually gonna. Many of you know this. It was there in my intro as well. I do a lot of work with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and I do that in part because I have a family member who has a mental illness. And one of the things that that has gone on in my family throughout the years of this my brother, who's now in his 40s, and there have been times when the members of our family who lived with him had to draw a line, right? Because I mean, this was an issue where your long-term flourishing includes you being on these medications, and also the flourishing of the whole household. If you're in it and not on your meds, it doesn't work well. So, I mean, what I'm basically saying is there was a time when, for the good of everyone, my parents kicked my brother out of our house. He was a young adult at that time. And that actually was an important part of him getting the help that he needed. So, I mean, this is the real complexity of how we engage long-term flourishing, and the short terms know what I think I need to flourish is this. And what I'm kind of segueing to here is I do think that there's another, there's an institutional question here, right? How do we as an institution say what kinds of support we can give when people say, I need this to flourish here? And are there moments where we need to say, actually, no, for the good of the whole community, we can't sustain. I mean, we could talk about all kinds of things related to this, right? But there's a certain, I mean, even, I think COVID showed, right? We can't sustain people who are going to flout these requirements at a certain point in order for us all to flourish. So it's, I don't know if that, hopefully that helps a little in thinking it through, but I'm sure there's much more we could talk about with regards to that.
Yeah, I wonder if you could, Comfort responded, great response, reminds me of mutual accommodation and the discourse for appreciating all cultural backgrounds in the classroom, which I think is a great point, Comfort.
Yeah, thanks, Comfort.
One of the one of the things that is related to this is that idea of responsibility. So when you're speaking about the common good, you talked about rights and responsibility. Could you speak a little more about where the responsibility is on the individual and where the responsibility is on the institution?
With regards to which in particular?
Yeah, so your point on the common good, you talked about the rights and responsibility to work towards the flourishing. When is it the responsibility of the individual to work towards the flourishing of the other individual, and when should it step in and be a larger institution having the responsibility for it?
Oh, so that's a really great question, and you caught me with one of my shortcuts in a way. So if you look at the second page of the handout, I skipped past the concept of subsidiarity, which is Roman numeral 3 on that. And this, I kind of tried to sneak it into the common good a little bit, but so subsidiarity basically covers this idea that the communities that we're a part of are kind of loosely structured in such a way that any problem or discernment about the good ought to happen at the smallest level possible. So in a way, it's first first the family, right? In as the smallest community, and then each higher institution. I mean, really the idea is to support the participation and engagement of those smaller groups in working towards their flourishing. The idea here is without supplanting their initiative and their ability to participate and build it themselves. Of course, sometimes you have somebody, I mean, whether you're talking about like a child or someone with a disability or something like that, who even as an individual needs extra help. I mean, I talked about the issue in my family. So that, again, it's the family kind of discerning it's good, right? And then at each level, you kind of build it out from there. So even thinking at Providence College, you could talk about, again, these communities overlap, right? It's not necessarily like government, like every city's in a county, every county's in a state, every state's in the nation. But it's much more like, okay, is this student club, does it have what it needs to flourish? And does this residence hall have, the residents of this floor have what they need to flourish? And again, it's to some extent, flourishing, I mean, we're as human persons and subjects, our flourishing is somewhat subjective, right? In the sense, I mean, think about the artist who says, I'm not flourishing unless I'm able to express myself in all my freedom, right? And somebody else is like, I just want to do my thing, right? Like whatever it is. So to some extent, it's self-defining. But again, the Catholic tradition does have these things like, as soon as I'm telling a lie, I'm acting contrary to my human nature, and I'm not flourishing, right? As soon as I'm killing other people, right? I'm also hurting their ability to flourish, right? So this is where these negatives, the things that we want to rule out, are a lot easier than to say, well, what does it look like positively for us to all flourish together?
Great. I think that leads into another question that I want to pose to you, and speaking to the truth. And you spoke about objective truth and truths, which is such an important part of our Providence College motto and virtue. And my question that I want to pose to you is, how are some of these principles objective truths that go beyond not just rules for Catholics to follow, but truths that people of all faiths can hold as truth?
So
I think I hear a lot in my dialogue of, okay, that's great for those who identify as Catholic, but if you're not Catholic, can you still participate in these, or are these still guiding principles for those who are not practicing Catholics?
Yeah, so I thought you were going in a slightly different direction. So I was actually, what's first in my mind is to say, to remind people that in some ways, before we even talk about truth, I mean, we should remember that Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," right? And I do think maybe one of the ways at this is, and so one of the long moral traditions in the church is something called the natural law, right? And this is this group of moral teachings that the church has always kind of insisted are available on the basis of reason alone. And they've included things like, so people are often surprised to know that the prohibition against lying is actually a natural law prohibition. And the idea here is that speech and communication was given for the purpose of communicating the truth, the reality of, whether it's the reality of what I feel or the reality of 2 + 2 is 4. And as soon as I start using that natural power for something other than what is intended, and in fact to manipulate what it was or destroy what it was intended to do, by its very nature, I'm in violation of that. So I think, and I would hope that we're more and more getting to a place where we can see that racism, right, which has been, I believe it was in Mater Magistra that it was first included in a list of intrinsically evil acts, like racism as something that is always wrong, regardless of the circumstances. I mean, I haven't really seen that done as a natural law argument, but it clearly is, right? It's rooted in the nature of what the human person is in all our dignity, right? So this is where I think that you don't, hopefully you don't have to be Catholic or Christian to see that. But the thing that I would add, though, is for those of us who are Catholic and or Christian and are aiming to be just holy, virtuous people, it's just so imperative that we do this work. And again, ideally, this is, I think, part of the great gift of Catholic social thought. It's always been pitched in such a way that people who share a passion for justice ought to be able to engage it, even if they're not going to agree that, oh yes, and Jesus Christ himself is truth. But I would also encourage, for what it's worth, non-Christians and non-Catholics on our campus to continue to invite and encourage the Christians on our campus to act as though we believe that the gospel that we preach. I'm not always perfect at it myself, and I'm a little scared inviting people to call me and others out like that. But there we go.
We'll provide Dana Dillon's direct cell phone number for anyone who wants to call her and call her out on that.
God help me.
You started off by speaking about, our Catholic social teaching, going back to the question of what does our Catholic teachings speak to us in this moment? When we look at the pandemic, we look at current issues, how do we respond to that question of using Catholic teaching to speak to us in this moment? Maybe even some reflection questions of how to know or where Catholic teaching can guide us.
So I'm having a little trouble wrapping my mind around this, because I can't think of any area of our lives that we shouldn't be turning to, Catholic teaching, to the gospel, et cetera, to guide us and reflect us and shape our responses. Yeah, is there? I don't know. Can you help me specify this a little bit better?
Yeah, maybe it's where I always get analogies wrong, but where it comes to a point of like, how are there certain principles, and maybe you added it on the second page, answers the question for the person who's asking, to help us guide to know how to live out preferential option for the poor on our campus. How do we know who the poor are, I think, is the question that it's getting to.
Oh, great. Okay. So that is a great question. And I think I think it's not always an easy answer. And here's why. I mean, so on one hand, I'm tempted to say, well, first listen to people. And if people tell you that they're feeling marginalized and excluded, then pay attention to that. And, you know, and again, I would invite that to be a little bit of discernment together, right? Like, okay, are there ways that, you know, you were welcome, but you didn't know it? And it's actually not a failure of welcome so much as a failure of communication or something like that, right? So that we, or were we welcoming you in a way that actually put you off, right? So again, dialogue together about that. But one reason why I hesitate to make, you know, listen to the voices be the only way to do that is, of course, we all know that the squeaky wheel gets the oil, as my parents used to say. And I think sometimes one of the things we need to try to pay attention to is who are those who are marginalized but also invisible, so that we don't even notice that we're leaving them out. And I will say, I mean, again, this is, I keep bringing this up, but I will say, because of my engagement with mental health work, I do think that this is a often invisible disability, right? Where people, you don't know that the person in the room is struggling. They're hiding it so well that they have their social anxiety issues. And so you don't know how deeply they're marginalized and vulnerable in that moment, for instance. And so I think there's the guidance is to pay attention to the voices who say that they're marginalized, and also find ways to look for others. And, you know, I will say, I was at a workshop not too long ago, and somebody said that with new members of their community, instead of asking, do you have a network of support? This person had learned to ask, tell me 3 or 4 people who are in your network of support, right? Because everybody's kind of, especially if you're kind of trying to fake it a little bit, right? You're going to say, oh yeah, I'm fine. I have a network of support. But when somebody asks you that question, and you don't have anybody you can name, if that person is paying attention, right? And I'm suggesting maybe we should be those people who ask this question, right? And somebody doesn't have anybody they can name, well, how can we put them in touch with somebody who would be a good network for them, or start that network, or maybe we be that person?
Yeah, which great. It ties back to the responsibility question we were speaking about earlier, of our responsibility on this campus now, and what does the right and responsibility look like? Another question that came in, I'm going to read it right off, says the common good consists of those conditions for flourishing. It's also those communities, family, parish, schools, and ultimately God, the cosmos, and ultimately God, we receive rather than build, and that perfects us. How can this robust idea of the common good as something that we both work towards but also receive inform our notions of justice?
Oh yeah, I mean, that's such a great idea, and I'm glad he brought that up. But because so this is something that comes back in Catholic social thought quite often, right? That as much as we want to, that we need to, we're responsible to work together to build a more just world. That the kind of fullness of the common good, in fact, is actually connected to the idea of peace in Catholic social thought. So that peace is actually what is realized when we finally totally realize the common good. And the sense there is that ultimately that fullness of peace is something that we can only receive from God as a gift, right? That it's crucial for us to keep working on as much as we can. I think about it was St. Ignatius of Loyola, sorry Dominicans, quoting a Jesuit founder here, but who said, work like everything depends on you, and pray like everything depends on God. And I think that's an important idea here, to think about all the ways that communities are givens in our lives, and we have to and we, as much as we have to work within them towards greater justice, also we have to recognize that fullness of justice is always going to be on the other side of the horizon. It's not something we can do. So the key thing is we've got to pair this with prayer. And I think I said I wasn't paying attention to the questions, but I actually noticed another one, and I think this connects that, so the question is about the demonization of those with whom we disagree. And I think one of the things that the prior question kind of points us to, I think very helpfully, is the idea that if we're imagining, like, gosh, Pam, if I could just get you to see it rightly the way I see it, then Providence College would be the utopia we need it to be. Well, there's a reminder here, I think, that that fullness is a gift that is only going to come through prayer, as well as hard work, but prayer. But also in the meantime, I need to figure out how it is that I can understand that truth that I'm trying to help you see my way, and you're trying to help me see your way, is also something that, again, as Catholics, we see it as a participation in Christ. And so there's that sense that the more that you and I can dialogue together as neighbors rather than enemies. And by the way, let me just remind anybody who's forgotten, Jesus called us to love our neighbors and our enemies, and also strangers, and the least of these, and all kinds of others. But it's important for us to remember not only that we are called to love our enemies, I think that's important because that's hard. That can be really hard sometimes. But also the people with whom we share a commitment to move a community towards justice, but with whom we have disagreements on what that justice looks like and includes, are not enemies, they're neighbors and they're partners, right? In building that work, I mean, you might be so wrong to see it the wrong way, in my opinion, but we move together better by understanding ourselves as neighbors and partners who happen to disagree, but who share some greater goals together.
Dr. Dillon, we're coming up at the end of our time, and I think we could go on. You and I have had countless conversations around these topics and could go on all day, but I want to leave you with one fun question to end us off. Storytelling and lived experiences have been a thread between the series and the summer. Could you maybe share a name or two of a Catholic figure or saint or writer that you would share with us to know their story or further their story that maybe embodies some of the things you're speaking about today?
So, yeah, I'm going to suggest that you look up, if you don't know her, Chiara Lubich, who is the founder of the Focolare movement. The Focolare movement is actually, they see their central charism as the spirituality of unity. And the Focolare movement emerged kind of during World War II and has grown throughout the last several years. Chiara Lubich, the foundress, just died in 2008. And this is a phenomenal story. The Focolare exist in pretty much every nation. There are people who practice the spirituality of the Focolare who are not Catholic, who are not Christian. She's been in dialogue with, she came in dialogue with Muslims in Harlem in, I think, the 1990s. Right, so she's just an incredible figure, thinking for those of us who want to think about working towards unity in the midst of difference.
I like that. I would be remiss if I didn't say mine would be Martin de Porres, who we have statues on all over campus, a Dominican and patron saint of racial justice and racial harmony, and public health workers. So right now, a patron saint that's needed.
Well, you get the bonus points for naming a Catholic and a Dominican.
You know, that's what I'm here for. I thank you again, Dana, for being with us today and sharing us this wisdoms. I look forward to continuing these conversations on campus and with the participants. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you. And I'll just invite anybody on this call or anybody who watches the recording later, if you have questions and you want to be in touch, drop me a line.
Thank you so much, Dana. Yeah, thank you all for being here, and thank you for giving us some scaffolding a framework, especially for those outside the tradition, to understand how do we pull from this tradition to contextualize our work. This is truly just a primer. There is much more conversation to be had and much more that we will have going into the fall, but thank you. By way of ending us off, I just wanted to let any remaining attendees on the call know that our series has 3 more weeks to go, and it will culminate in Father Sicard sharing with us and fleshing out even more what his vision for our community is when it comes to the beloved community. So we look forward to that. In 3 weeks, you'll get emails. There's every week we have a session, and I'm excited about next week. It's a round table with 3 of our elders from the inaugural class of women at PC, and we will be hearing their experience of the beloved community, what's changed 50 years later since they got here. So tune in for that next week. I think that, yeah, other than that, you have the handout for further learning, and we'll close out our webinar here today. Thank you all. Have a good one.